Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma, and joining me on this episode of the Ideas Factory is Professor Harsh Pant. The world is still grappling with COVID-19 coming out of the lockdown, but America seems to be more than normal, and it is a very deliberate attempt to project that everything is very normal, and it starts with President Donald Trump and staff of the White House who are flouting the established norms and roaming around without masks, and a couple of things happening there, which is a very deliberate attempt to project that everything is now back to normal. But is it? As the cases are rising up, there are many steps that have been taken in America. So that's one thing that we are going to look at. And other than that, India's neighbors, we look at China, we look at Nepal, Bangladesh, we look at what's China doing in South Asia and what are its plans here really. So all of that today on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Welcome, Harsh, and I would like to begin with America. What's happening there? First of all, the passing of the National Defense Authorization Act, which seems to be an effort in protecting the American military and maintaining its or restoring its supremacy, be it land, sky, cyberspace, air. And they've said that it is an attempt actually to restore America's advantage vis-a-vis China and Russia. How do you see, how is America assessing threat to the various areas from these countries?
I think what is important, Naghma, here is that this was a huge bipartisan vote on NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, and a huge jump in the defense budget that it authorizes, because there seems to be now an acknowledgement that other powers, in particular China and Russia, pose a very, very severe challenge to American supremacy, serious challenge. And that is being reflected across the board, across the political spectrum. So I think in some ways, the debate that a lot of the, that we are hearing in a lot of quarters, for example, what will happen to America's China policy once Mr. Trump is gone? I think this act, the passing of this act, the kind of votes that it mustered, tells you that the environment as far as China is concerned has changed dramatically. Of course, there is Russia angle as well there, but the China factor, that China used to be, we had seen in the past big debates on how to handle China. Today, and I think that is perhaps going to be the lasting legacy of Mr. Trump, that he has changed the environment as far as China is concerned. There is a lot of bipartisan consensus, and there is a consensus that, and this NDAA talks about it, that Indo-Pacific is the theater where most action is going to happen, and America has to match up to what China is doing. America has to raise its game. It has to reach to allies, to partners. It has to spend more money on defense platforms. It has to project more power in the Indo-Pacific to at least make a case that it remains a serious contender in the region, because there might be a sense in many countries in the region that America is not interested, that America is withdrawing from the region. And I think this act tells you that on both sides of the aisle, there is complete consensus on this one issue. And therefore, going forward, it seems to me that whatever happens in November elections, this is going to be, a trajectory that on which American policymakers would continue. Whoever comes to office, Mr. Trump re-elected or Mr. Biden, we are going to see a strong China policy, a policy that is aimed at managing the turbulence in Indo-Pacific in particular, and in projecting power in that region.
So there is a kind of a permanent change that we see there as respect to China. When we look at the other things, the other decisions, it seems like the decision to suspend the H1B visa along with many other visas, but the suspension of the H1B visa will affect the Indian IT professionals majorly, also China, but a lot of workers go from India. So all these are efforts to secure the American jobs, to put America first. So there are all these efforts because there is vast-ranging unemployment that we see in America after the pandemic. But, many companies, many firms who employ these foreign nationals have said that there are certain jobs where they require foreign nationals. And if these people are not coming in, it is going to affect America as well. It is going to affect American economy. But this decision to suspend these visas, which may happen now, there is no finality to it, but it may happen in October. So how do you see this affecting, and the projection that America first, giving jobs to Americans, to the locals?
I think this is going to be an enormous challenge for any administration and for Mr. Trump in particular as he moves into the election cycle, because all countries are having to navigate this dilemma as to how far, as even Indian Prime Minister said that the biggest lesson he has learned is self-reliance. So how can you mesh this idea of self-reliance with the larger requirements that you have in the short to medium term? And that's exactly what Mr. Trump is facing. That as he looks at the massive economic losses, unemployment losses, that unemployment problem that America faces, how does he manage this in the short to medium term in particular? Because elections are in the short term. So how does he manage that? How does he tell his electorate that he has done everything possible to protect those interests, to protect employment, and therefore give out a message that even H1B visas, things like H1B visas are on the table, and they would be discussed and thrashed out, and if required, they would be suspended. As we are being told that no decision has been made on that yet, but it is on the table. It can be cut, it can be suspended. And the message is clearly that America will first look at its own employment and economic problems before it it makes a global pitch. But it compounds America's problems also, as you were highlighting minutes back. That you have American companies and American chambers of commerce who have written to Mr. Trump saying that this can be very problematic, because if American economy rebounds, if American economy comes back on tracks, then how do we make sure that that economy is functional if we don't have the required expertise? And H1B visas are targeted at these kinds of people, at these kinds of specialists who come in for short periods of time, who give America that vital technological edge that is needed, vital expertise that is needed. And that is something that America has taken advantage of from throughout the world. And that has been one of the reasons why, when it comes to IT and other sorts of technologies, America is at the cutting edge of the world. So I think there is this dilemma of short and long term. How do you manage these trends? But going forward, given the electoral cycle, given the massive economic problems, clearly for Mr. Trump and for any politician, at this point, the focus would be, how do I make my constituency hear my case, that I have done everything possible for you? And I think in this, H1B visas are a fair game.
So to make his constituency hear very clearly that he's doing everything possible for them, there is another step that he's taking in that direction, and that's deliberate optics to project that everything is now normal. He's probably even scheduling mass rallies. And in the White House, inside the White House, there have been pictures of the staff who are flouting the established norms. And there is the coronavirus cases in the country, in many parts of the country, are still on the upswing. But there is an effort, a deliberate optics to project that everything is now normal and we are back. But where does, this is basically deliberately looking away from the problem. And first he surrendered to the pandemic after all, but now he's trying to say that everything is normal. Now it's business as usual.
Yes, I think it's it's quite ironic, because he started off from this position in the initial months. In January, he was saying no problem at all. There is not a big deal. It's a normal flu. It will come and go. It's cyclical. He was in fact appreciating China and how well China has done. And then suddenly, as the crisis emerged and crisis hit him in the face, he realized that he cannot really be talking of normalcy, and he changed the course. But clearly, I think the pressure is now on him, given the kind of economic problems that are emerging in America, and given other problems. We are, the race riots, for example, the African American discontent that has emerged. That is, I think, has pulled his polling numbers down, and those polling numbers are, they are being reflected in him getting a bit impatient with the status quo, and he thinks that by projecting a sense of normalcy, that he can project a sense of improved governance in the country, that he's the one who brought the country back to on tracks, and therefore this argument that he has been an effective governance politician, that he has been an effective president at a very critical time in America, and I think that's the message he wants to send. Also, the more focus is on normalcy, on day-to-day activity. He thinks that he can convey, or he can at least make a case to a lot of the corporate sector, that they also need to come back and start working so that at least in the short to medium term, the kind of economic crisis that is looming on America can be projected as being handled. So I think there are multiple issues that he's trying to use this optics for, but it can also rebound on him. It can have massive negative reaction, because if the crisis, if it continues, and we are being told that the numbers are rising now in the hinterland in America. It was first the big cities, and now the numbers are rising. There's a second wave coming. And if that happens, then clearly the pressure will be on him, he will find it very difficult to again take a U-turn and then say, well, we are again in a crisis mode. So I think what he's primarily doing is to look at the November elections, is to trying to figure out what is the best pitch for him and how he can make a best argument about his candidacy. But I think increasingly there are other factors which are taking the wind out of his sails, which are making life difficult for him. And these extraneous factors will have a very big impact on how this electoral cycle unfolds. And I think this is true for both candidates. We really don't know anything at this point where we can definitively say that either Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump are on a strong wicket, or one is on a weak wicket, because there are too many unknowns at this point, which I think are creating problems and making it difficult for us to assess the trajectory of this electoral cycle.
Too many unknowns and unknown unknowns, and there is firefighting happening on many fronts. And like you said earlier, we discussed the National Defense Authorization Act, which is especially focusing on Russia and China and how to maintain and kind of restore the American supremacy there, or the American advantage. So China seems to be a big threat, because there's also focus on the Huawei 5G architecture. But when we talk of China, I also want to discuss what's happening with India and China along the LAC. So there seems to be now a gradual pullback of Indian troops and the Chinese troops, but it is very gradual and it is very staggered. And while that's happening, it's just one phase. There is still a kind of standoff near the Pangong. So when we look at this pullback, and when we look at the tension that was there, the standoff that was there, how do you assess this now, this current pulling back of troops? Is everything back to normal? Of course, it's a very long process. We don't know what really is happening diplomatically. Talks are going on, but at the military level, there have been engagements there too. But we can't really assume, can we, that things are now normal?
No, not at all. I think, in fact, what seems to have happened is that the last Saturday's senior level military interaction between the two sides seems to have produced a tentative result for both sides. And that result has been that on some critical points, I think Galwan Valley as well as Hot Springs in Ladakh, we have seen some disengagement happening. Now, that disengagement tells you one story, that both sides in some ways remain committed to resolving this problem through dialogue. And that's a more optimistic side of the story. But I think what remains problematic and what remains difficult is that the more difficult sides, the more difficult questions remain on the table. And as you say, the whole Pangong area remains contested. There, where Indian positions are, they remain hardened. Where Chinese positions are, they remain hardened. And there has been no movement on that front. In fact, India had conveyed to the Chinese that we would be building the road, the Daulat Begoldi road that we have been constructing for a while, and that has been the cause of some of these problems. That India will not take a step back on that because it is on Indian side of the LAC, and in China continues to resist that. So the critical points are still remain on the table, and in fact, we also heard and we also came to know, I think, just this week, that it was not simply these critical areas which were sort of being, looked at and which were contested by both sides over the last month. There have been reports that all along the LAC, there were problems, and all along the LAC, Chinese and Indian forces were ramping up their presence. So clearly, I think both sides recognize that there is a huge challenge for them. And the disengagement process is going to be very, very long, very, very slow, And I don't think we can expect Doklam-like resolution to this crisis, because Doklam was a very specific geographical point where one could assess immediately whether the two sides are coming are trying to disengage, or whether the two sides want to continue. But here in this case, because it's a massive boundary, because there are a number of fronts on which the two sides have opened up to each other, have been standing off, have been eyeball to eyeball. I think this crisis will continue for some time, unless you have till such time perhaps as the weather makes it difficult for the two sides. But what is I think optimistic, what is I think positive here, is that the two sides continue to be guided by the larger resolve of the two leaders, which is that which is the sort of the Wuhan idea, that let us not escalate these problems to a strategic level, and let the resolution be found through mutual dialogue. So whether it is the military dialogue or the diplomatic dialogue, both of them have actually reaffirmed the aspect of Modi, Xi, and Wuhan so-called spirit.
Okay, so let's hope that the Wuhan spirit is intact. Well, while we're talking of China, I want to just bring to your notice the paper that ORF published by Derek Grossman, which talks of what does China want in South Asia. And he's written there that the way China is securing its national interest in South Asia, it is detrimental to almost all the countries, if not all, but almost all the countries. And when we look at this paper, in light of this paper, I want to ask you very briefly about what's happening in Bangladesh and China. China has offered to help Bangladesh fight the pandemic, but it also wants a sister city alliance. Now, the sister city alliance Beijing has had with many, many countries, many cities in the world, but it is, the thought, the intention behind this proposal is suspect, and there is a kind of unease about this. And then when we think about the whole paper or the whole idea, what does Beijing really, what does China want in South Asia? Also, how China is promoting its cultural and commercial ties in many countries in South Asia, be it Nepal, be it Bangladesh. We've seen what's happening in Nepal and the increased aggressiveness that Nepal has been showing lately.
Yeah, I think China's role in South Asia, and in India's neighborhood has been growing for the last few decades. It is, there is a reason why China is today the single largest trading partner of most countries in the region, including India, by the way. So clearly China's role has grown, China's imprint has grown, China's profile has grown, and China therefore feels more confident than ever in shaping the regional landscape. And there was a time when China was hardly present in the South Asian discussions. Today, you cannot have any reasonable conversation on South Asia, South Asian problems without bringing in the China factor. So there is clearly a larger sort of a dynamic to China's presence in the region that cannot be ignored, that India should not be ignoring. And some of it perhaps is also India's fault in not recognizing this challenge earlier on and not taking ameliorative measures.
Yeah.
But I think what we are now looking at is something more problematic in some ways, that from a purely commercial relationship, trade relationship, or even basic relationship that is about defense, today China wants to dictate terms to these countries. China wants to shape the foreign and security policies of these countries in ways that perhaps is not only detrimental to Indian interests, but I think as the paper you referred to by Derek Grossman points out, to the detriment of these countries themselves. So it's not entirely evident that the kind of economic packages that China is offering to countries in the region, the kind of, as you pointed out with Bangladesh, its sister city alliances that China is offering, that would do anything to contribute in terms of capacity building, in terms of the developmental prospects of these countries. Yes. Instead, China may have a very clear geostrategic imperative here, which might be not only to encircle India, but also to make sure that these countries, these smaller countries' foreign policies are shaped by China's own interests rather than the legitimate interests of these countries. So I think, again, the problems that you are mentioning, in the case of Bangladesh, we are looking at this sort of sister city arrangement. With Nepal, we are looking at a very, very difficult time ahead for India-Nepal relations, given a border issue, and how KP Oli has ratcheted up to a level where he would find it very difficult to back down. And of course, in Pakistan, it's a very different ball game. But I think the Pakistan template is now being offered to other countries. It would be interesting to see how many countries bite the bullet, because clearly we know from Pakistan's experience that the Chinese, not only offer solutions, they more often than not create more problems. So whether the countries, the smaller nations in the region remain immune from that remains to be seen. But I think what is important here is that for them,
Yes.
China is an alternative to India. And India being the bigger country in the region, they often feel that India is a big brother, and therefore they need to reach out to other states. And China is an easier country to reach out to because of China's own interest in undermining India, and because of China's own interest in making itself more prevalent, more potent in South Asia.
Thank you so much for that discussion on this episode, Harsh. Like you said, China is making sure that it reaches out to most countries in the neighborhood, in India's neighborhood, and also through its BRI and promoting its cultural and commercial interests, and making sure that the foreign policies of these countries are shaped according to Chinese interests rather than the interests of those countries. Thank you so much. We have time for just this much on this episode. We'll see you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Naghma.